Well, Mr. Vice President, I always like to start with the news. So I thought perhaps you might like to send a clear message to your former colleagues in the House of Representatives. You served in that House for many years, representing the state of Indiana. What would you like to tell them as they consider a very critical vote on Saturday evening for additional assistance for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan? Do you have a message for them?
Well, I do.
Great.
And that is, America is the leader of the free world. And it's time for America to lead again. I truly do believe that we're living in a dire moment for freedom. My wife, Karen, who joins me here today, Heather, we traveled across the border from Poland 1 month after the unprovoked Russian invasion in Ukraine. We saw literally thousands of women and children of every age carrying all their earthly possessions on their backs at a refugee center. I returned there last year. I went to Kyiv. I walked through streets where atrocities had occurred. And then it was the first week of this year that I traveled back to our cherished ally, Israel. I traveled to the south of Israel, to small communities along the border of Gaza that were beset by the most unspeakable violence imaginable. I mean, literally men, women, and children slaughtered as an invasion of Hamas terrorists came across the border at 90 different points along the fence line. And now we saw just in the last week, for the first time in modern history, Iran launched an attack directly against Israel. China continues its provocations in the Asia-Pacific. We're living in a time of widening threats. But I believe the gathering storm that we face is even greater. The potential for threats to the free world are even greater. And there's no substitute for American leadership. As I said, America is the leader of the free world, and I would call on all my old friends in the Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, to rally around Speaker Mike Johnson as he brings legislation to the floor to do America's part to renew our support for Ukraine, for Israel, for Taiwan, and for freedom in the world.
Mr. Vice President, do you think it will pass? Are you optimistic?
I am. Because first and foremost, as you said, I served in Congress for 12 years. It seemed longer.
Uh-oh.
But I also served as president of the Senate for 4 years.
That's right.
I know the men and women in both political parties who represent our country. And I believe the overwhelming majority of members of Congress in both political parties understand the historic obligation the United States of America has to lead. I mean, it's truly remarkable to think of the 80 years ago when American soldiers had to land at Normandy. 40 years later, Ronald Reagan would go to Pointe du Hoc and speak about the bitter lessons of World War II. He said then, and I also believe, and have said around the country, that isolationism is never the answer to tyrannical regimes with expansionist intent. And I believe the majority of members of Congress understand that. And I believe they'll meet this moment. And I want to commend Speaker Mike Johnson, who I consider a personal friend, for demonstrating moral courage in this moment, in a very difficult time. Now, look, I understand the frustration of some members of Congress about challenges at home. I mean, candidly, President Biden's policies unleashed the worst inflation in 40 years. He undid the policies that we put into place at the southern border and created the worst border crisis in American history. But anyone who thinks that we can't solve our problems at home and be the leader of the free world has a pretty small view of the greatest nation on earth. We can do both. And I believe Speaker Johnson and the vast majority of members of Congress know that, and I'm hopeful before the weekend is out that we'll see American leadership renewed across the world.
Mr. Vice President, you now lead an organization called Advancing American Freedom, and part of that organization is to help end this growing sense of isolation in the United States. And of course, as you were on the campaign trail and primary, I just love your feeling of how do you talk to the American people about that need for leadership, because we hear so often about the fatigue, the war fatigue, that we want someone else to take this burden. What did you encounter, and how did you counter that message?
Well, I believe there is a rising tide of isolationism emerging in both political parties. In the Democratic Party, it manifests itself in opposition to support for Israel. I mean, look, the attack on October 7th was the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And I, for my part, believe that Israel must continue to take the fight against the terrorists of Hamas until they hunt down and destroy Hamas once and for all. And I fully anticipate, as has been said publicly, that Israel will also take action against Iran. Simply make it clear that they will not tolerate firing 300 missiles and drones at innocent civilians all across Israel. Just because the attack was frustrated doesn't change the intent of the attack. But nevertheless, there are voices on the left in the Democratic Party who I believe have been speaking out in such a way from the floor of the Congress to rallies around the country that have shaped the rhetoric of the Biden administration with regard to that conflict. And I think if the world knows nothing else, the world should know this: America stands with Israel. Now, on the right, I would tell you there's also a rising tide of Republican isolationism, where many who are frustrated with the failed economic policies of this administration, the failed policies of the Biden administration at the southern border, are now saying that we have to choose. But I believe Republicans learned hard lessons a century ago. It was in the Republican Party that isolationism found its home in the 1930s. But as President Reagan said, and I quoted earlier, we learned bitter lessons in World War II. We don't get a holiday from history. And so I'll continue to be a strong voice against isolationism on the left, and also isolationism that's emerging on the Republican right. I simply believe in that principle that look, if you're willing to fight America's enemies on your soil with your soldiers, we'll give you the means to fight them there so we don't have to fight them. That was articulated first in the 1980s, and I'm someone who believes that it contributed significantly to America winning the Cold War. But there are those who think that if we continue to support the Ukrainian military with resources, that it'll somehow lead us to World War III. I believe the opposite is true. I believe the real lesson of history is when we falter in our commitment, when we don't take tyrannical regimes seriously, and we don't take dictators at their word. That risks the freedom of the world, and it risks another day like 80 years ago this year that we would have to come and fight after freedom is lost. Because I often reminded people out on the campaign trail when I was running for president last year that, if Vladimir Putin is allowed to overrun Ukraine, I have no doubt in my mind that the time would come that he would cross a border that our men and women in uniform would have to fight. I thought Speaker Johnson put it well yesterday when he said, "I'd rather send bullets than boys." And the truth is, we ought to continue to support the courageous military in Ukraine so they can fight and repel that Russian invasion. We need to renew our support for Israel in this dark hour, and we need to give Taiwan the resources they need to defend their democracy. I really believe in peace through strength, but it's also true that weakness arouses evil. And I maintain that the best pathway toward a peaceful, stable, and free world is by renewed American strength and the strength of our allies.
Mr. Vice President, while you were Vice President, President Trump profoundly shook credibility of the United States as a NATO ally. And there's continued concern that the United States, should former President Trump be elected, will not be a credible ally when all of these dangers happen. What is your view on the criticality of our European allies for American leadership and that peace through strength?
Well, I served alongside the president for 4.5 years, and I'm proud of the record we created. But some people think we're a little bit different. He had his own way of talking about things. I have my own way of talking about things. And I will tell you, the president had some pretty tough words for some of our NATO allies early in the days of our administration. I'll never forget my first trip to Europe was to go to the Munich Security Conference, Heather.
I was there.
And you were there. And I remember there was a general sense in the European community that the United States was going to embrace some full-scale new isolationism. We were going to pull in the shutters and even risk these historic alliances that we're celebrating now 75 years with NATO. And I remember stepping up to the podium at the Munich Security Conference, and as I wrote in my book, I have been in warmer refrigerators. The crowd was a little cold. But I stood up and I said, you need to understand that America first does not mean America alone. And then I proceeded to articulate in words that the president and I had gone over line by line, an approach to our allies in Europe that was to say, we are going to continue to meet our commitments, but we need you to meet your commitments to our common defense. And I will tell you, Heather, for all the back and forth, a lot of the tension, a lot of the rhetoric, and it probably is reflected in some of the feelings today. By the time we left office, our allies were contributing $140 billion more to our common defense in the NATO alliance than they were the day we came in. Now I think that worked because of the combination the president and I took. It was a little bit of the, little bit of the tough love, and then I would translate with European leaders.
That tough love did a lot of damage, though, sir.
I'm telling you.
It did a lot of damage.
But the truth was that I think there were only 2 other nations that were meeting their 2% goal that everyone had agreed to when we came in. And I would submit to you that our NATO allies today are in a better position to have been supporting Ukraine over the last 2 years because of those increases in defense spending than they would have been otherwise. So, look, as I said, the president and I are different men. We handle things and express things differently. But I think it's absolutely essential, whether it's here in Europe, whether it's in the Asia Pacific, that our allies meet the commitments and the promises we've made to one another for our common defense. So that's how we achieve peace through true strength.
How will you be advocating for allies and peace through strength now that you are in the private sector and are working with your own organization? What role do you see yourself playing now in the future?
Well, I think that'll be a decision for the future. You know, Karen and I love to say we don't know what the future holds, but we know who holds the future. But for now, I'm just going to continue to be a voice for the things that I've always believed in. You know, my grandfather immigrated to America from Ireland. He stepped off onto Ellis Island in 1923. That's Richard Michael Conley signed the book on Ellis Island, and that's how Michael Richard Pence got to be Vice President of the United States of America. I mean, I watched my family live the American dream, but my father was a combat veteran in the Korean War. And the combination of the upbringing that I got from my grandparents and most especially my parents built into me a belief in American exceptionalism and also in America's obligations as the leader of the free world. I honestly believe, as you think in these challenging times when people say, well, what is the solution? I think American leadership is the solution. And one of the things I learned when I was vice president is there's no leading from behind for the United States. I mean, I honestly think if America's not leading the free world's not being led. We're the indispensable leader. And I heard that from presidents and prime ministers of allies in all my 4 years. And I think it's another reason why your first question was so important, where we start. And it's one that I hope my old friends in Congress are thinking very deeply about, is we're not just another country on the list being asked to help. We're in a very real sense the indispensable leader of the free world. And but it was believing that and believing in limited government, believing in the values on which I was raised that drew me to the Republican Party. And what I'll tell you about my future is I'm just going to continue to champion those conservative values that I've always championed throughout my life and my career, and we'll see where we go.
So can we talk a little bit about the health of American democracy? Mm-hmm. The peaceful transfer of power was profoundly questioned in our country on January 6th, and you were in the epicenter of that moment that continues to have strong reverberations across the United States. How confident are you that we will have another peaceful transfer of power, not the questionable transfer, but that we won't have civil unrest, that America believes in democracy, our young people believe in democracy when we have so much foreign influence, and of course, even our leaders are projecting talking points from adversaries. You yourself are very concerned about the influence of TikTok. Give us some words of encouragement as we head towards November the 5th that we won't have a repeat of January the 6th, because our allies are looking at us, wanting that to be that leader, but seeing that we perhaps are so polarized that we can't be that stable, credible leader that they thought they could rely on and now question whether they can.
First, let me say I'm humbled and grateful by your gracious words about our service on January 6th. I'll always believe by God's grace I did my duty that day to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and see to the peaceful transfer of power. But let me tell you why I'm confident about the future.
Good.
Despite the rioting that happened that day and the divisions that have emerged since. And frankly, I would say to you, Heather, the fact that during our administration we lived through 4 years where the losing party said that we weren't legitimately elected. Literally, the standard bearer for the Democratic Party and others spent 2.5 years trying to make the case that we'd won the election through colluding with the Russian government, until after that was dismissed, and some still repeat that. So we literally went through 2 elections where the losing party essentially questioned the outcome, the legitimacy of the outcome. But let me say why I'm confident about the future. And maybe it's that, when we left the administration, we moved back to Indiana. I bought 5 acres and a pond, bought a riding mower, pickup truck. I mean, we're back in the heartland. And I often tell people that I think our politics is more divided today than ever before in my lifetime. But I'm not convinced the American people are as divided as our politics. I mean, you get 15 miles out of Washington, D.C., the people in our country get along pretty well. We really do. And if you ever doubt that, go to a town that was hit by a tornado or by flooding or by wildfires or worse, and see the way total strangers show up without being invited. And they don't ask the politics of the people whose house they walk up to. They just say, how can we help? And I really believe the American people are the most hardworking, innovative, generous, caring, faith-filled, patriotic people the world's ever known. We just need government as good as our people again. And that's what I believe that we'll have, and we'll have soon. Because I think the American people will demand it. I think as I traveled around in my campaign, I more often than not had people come up to me and express their appreciation for our service, but then say to me, particularly on the issues that are so much of the focus of the Brussels Forum and the German Marshall Fund, they would say to me, you're right about American leadership. And then they'd tell me about the member of their family that's in the military. And they sometimes knew that my son's a captain in the Marine Corps. And one of my unworthy son-in-laws is a lieutenant in the Navy. And we'd make that connection. Yeah. But everywhere I went, people would say to me, we understand, we get it, and we're with you. And I think polls bear that out. Most Americans recognize our unique role in the world. And I think the American people are going to demand not only the vitality of our democracy going forward, but they're also going to continue to demand that America do our part. Solve our problems at home, but also be that indispensable leader that the free world requires.
What's the future of the Republican Party and its foreign policy? Is it the values of one individual, or is it the values that you've articulated here? Values that many would say was the party of my father, but doesn't feel like the party of my children. Mm-hmm. What does it look like? I would say, Heather, I would often hear from people that say that the problem you've got is you're running in a Republican Party that doesn't exist anymore. Is that true? Then I would tell them, come out on the campaign trail with me for a while. Because people that I encounter, look, there's a lot of cross currents in American politics today. There's a lot of frustration. And we don't talk enough about that disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. That I think set the stage in ways that emboldened Russia to cross the border of Ukraine and have emboldened authoritarian regimes around the world. And it left a deep mark in the heart of the American people because it's so dishonored 20 years of service and sacrifice. Not just by Americans. It left a deep mark for our allies who were with us for 20 years as well. I was in the middle of a sentence to say that because I was just in Denmark and I took the opportunity to thank them. Because every time I traveled to Afghanistan, as a member of Congress, as a governor, and as vice president, it wasn't just the American flag flying over those encampments. It was the flags of our allies who, when our nation was struck on September the 11th, Article 5 initiated for the very first time. Our allies didn't ask if, they just said when, and they went. Absolutely. And it was a testament to the strength of NATO, and the sacrifices that our allies endured need to be remembered. But that's what's so dishonored, made dishonorable that moment. But I honestly believe, look, Vladimir Putin is responsible for that unprovoked invasion, and he needs to be held to account. Hamas is responsible. Iran, their patrons, are responsible. But I really do believe that, as I said before, weakness arouses evil. And I believe that disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan that literally left America's allies on the ground to the machinations of the Taliban and squandered 20 years and emboldened authoritarian regimes. Think about it. Vladimir Putin, when he invaded, I found this out in our first month there, when he invaded Ukraine, he said this thing's going to be over in a couple of weeks. Well, it worked out a little bit different because of the strength of the Ukrainian soldier, the courage and character of their people, and frankly, the support that the United States of America and our allies have provided over the past 2 years. But the sense of that was that I think he thought it would go about like Afghanistan went, which was once the Taliban began to move, once they rolled into Mazar al-Sharif in the north, Americans were out,
the Afghan National Army threw their guns down, took off their uniforms, melded into the public, and President Ghani flew away. It's one of the reasons why I think President Zelensky, who I came to know a bit when I was vice president, before all this came to pass, I thought spoke into history some words that we'll never forget. He essentially said, when the Biden administration offered to send a plane in the early days of the war, he said, "We don't need a plane, we need ammunition." And that's
and they really
great
need
credit to
ammunition
him
right
and
now.
to his character.
Right,
And,
absolutely.
But I honestly believe that people across the country are frustrated with a sense that America, under the current American administration, has been weakened at home and abroad. And they're going to demand American strength. I think it accounts for some of the enduring appeal of my old running mate. But I think at the end of the day, you're going to see the American people, they're going to demand a renewed commitment to American strength. I think it will begin this weekend on Capitol Hill, so help us God.
Do you think the American people understand this unique alignment? We now have China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea helping one another in multiple theaters. I often hear the reflection from some in the Republican Party that it is only China. Everything else we're wasting our resources in Europe. Everything else is a distraction. There's that one challenge. How did you frame it on the campaign trail, and what do we need to do to help people understand this dangerous moment where we don't have the luxury of choosing the theater? We have to defend our allies and ourselves in multiple places.
Heather, I think you put your finger right on it, not surprisingly. It seems to it's become fashionable, particularly in Republican circles, to say, well, we're for standing up to China. And I'm pleased that a bill that is expected to move in this package of bills this weekend will force the sale of TikTok, which is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party and represents an unprecedented propaganda platform, and will force the sale to the hands of freedom-loving people in our country or around the world. But you're right. It's become somewhat acceptable to say, well, we can stand strong on China, but we can't worry about Ukraine. And as I said, some on the left and a few on the right say we shouldn't be supporting Israel to the extent that we are. But they are all interconnected. I mean, the truth is that the times in which we're living, we've seen the emergence of a new axis of evil between Russia and China and Iran and North Korea. They're provisioning one another in their relative fights and their interests. I've met President Xi. I've spoken to him one-on-one. I've studied his words. I've given tough speeches about our administration's stand on China, immediately following a tough speech that he gave when we were at an international conference in Papua New Guinea. So I understand who we're dealing with. But I also understand that China's watching the world. What I would often tell people is the most effective way to send a deafening message to China to restrain their territorial ambitions in the Asia Pacific is to give Ukraine what they need to fight and repel that Russian invasion. I mean, I really believe that. I mean, I have to believe in my heart that President Xi is watching very intently to see if the West falters. And not just America, but our allies in the West. And if Vladimir Putin, I would submit to you, if Vladimir Putin were able to overrun Ukraine, I think two things would happen. Number one, I think it would not be very long before he crossed the border that our men and women would have to go and fight under Article 5. But number two, I think it would not be long before we saw action in the Taiwan Straits or somewhere in the South China Sea. Because I honestly believe that it would set into motion a domino effect that would embolden authoritarian regimes. Just as I said, our 40th president said, isolationism is never the answer to tyrannical regimes with expansionist intent. It wasn't 80 years ago, and it isn't today. And I'll continue to be a voice for American strength.
Mr. Vice President, one last question, because I've asked everyone here, what defining choice will you make in 2024? So is there one choice that will define you this year, something that you will do that will have an impact in this dangerous, challenging world we've just described?
Well, I made a choice to come to the German Marshall
Well, that was a choice.
Fund, and I'm really glad I did.
Oh, I'm really glad you did too. Thank you, sir.
I thank you for the warm welcome. I truly do. The other thing, I'm going to choose to believe in the American people.
Have faith.
I'm going to have faith. I mean, I would tell you, in my 20 years of public service, as a congressman, as a governor, and as a vice president, my opinion of government largely went down. Not a fan, generally. But my opinion of the American people went up every day. I mean, when you're in the roles that I was in, particularly as vice president, as a governor, sometimes you see people in the toughest moments in their lives. You see the generosity and the goodness of the American people coming alongside neighbors. When you travel, as I've had the privilege to do, to visit our soldiers downrange, I stopped by our embassies here in Brussels today, and 2 out of 3 of the ambassadors said hello. But I really went to see the Marines.
Always a good.
Because our son's
good.
a Marine. And I just had to stop in and thank him. Far away from home, serving on the other part of the world, standing a post. And at this hour, I've had the privilege to meet, and I didn't wear the uniform of the United States, so it always humbles me. But I've had a chance to meet this generation of men and women, particularly since September 11th, who stepped up, stepped into the fight. I've stood at the graveside with family members in Indiana who laid to rest heroes who answered that call. And I want to tell you, I have great confidence in the American people. So the choice that I'm going to make in 2024 is to keep articulating what I know to be true about a strong national defense, about American leadership in the world, about a limited constitutional government that lives within our means and preserves the liberties of every American, regardless of race or creed or color. And I'm going to continue to believe in the values of faith and family and life. And I'm going to continue to believe that the American people, if we articulate those things, if we express them with respect and decency, if we return a level of civility to public life, that the American people will rally around those ideals once again. And with your help and your good work at the German Marshall Fund and with God's help, we'll have government as good as our people again.
Thank you, Mr.
That's my
Vice
choice.
President. I really appreciate it. Please warmly join me in thanking Mr. Vice President.